The water crisis is a global reality. The UN says 2.2 billion individuals still do not have access to safe potable water, and nearly 3.5 billion remain without proper sanitation. While 4 billion people suffer severe water shortages at least 1 month per year, Africa is particularly affected by this crisis. 40% of people lack drinking water access, and over 70% lack basic sanitation. It is a situation unacceptable morally. And while it continues, our collective responsibility will remain engaged.
A quiet change is unfolding in one West African state, ladies and gentlemen. Big buildings rise near the coast, whilst a deep need is raised on the world stage. These two moves actually linked by one shared goal that now draws careful attention. The story begins along the coast of Senegal, ladies and gentlemen, where new work sites have started to take shape. In two nearby areas, ladies and gentlemen, Sendou and of course Bagni, major industrial projects were actually opened by the head of state or the president of state, President Faye. One project is a factory built to make edible vegetable oil for local use. The other is a large industrial zone set, aside for many private businesses. Together, these sites cover a very wide area of land, ladies and gentlemen, and mark a new step in the country's growth. So the moment was calm, and of course formal, with officials and workers present, and the focus stayed on long-term development, ladies and gentlemen. Now the oil factory is actually designed to process crops grown by local farmers. This helps keep more value inside the country or the state, ladies and gentlemen, instead of sending raw goods away. The industrial zone nearby is meant to host many kinds of companies, both now and of course later. Roads, power and workspaces are planned so that firms can actually operate side by side. This setup is actually meant to support trade and of course steady jobs over time, and the plan is to grow it step by step, ladies and gentlemen. The aim is slow but steady progress that can actually last, ladies and gentlemen. These actions did not actually happen in isolation, ladies and gentlemen. They came as part of a wider effort to strengthen local industry by building and of course processing at home, ladies and gentlemen. The country hopes to support farmers, workers and of course small suppliers. Each part of the plan fit into a larger picture of economic balance. So the early stages are simple, but the intent is clear and of course careful, inviting close intention. Before we continue, ladies and gentlemen, please make sure that you take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and of course turn on notifications. Your support helps clear news reach more important people like you. Thank you so much for your understanding. Now let's continue deeper. Many groups are actually involved in these new projects, ladies and gentlemen. The national government provides support and of course guidance, whilst private companies bring funds and of course skills. Local workers are expected to fill main roles. From building to daily operations, farmers also play a key part as their crops supply the oil plant. This link between land, labor and of course industry is seen as important for steady income and of course food supply. So each group has a role that connects to the next, ladies and gentlemen. So as these projects move forward, another message from the same country reached beyond its borders. At a meeting, ladies and gentlemen, linked to the United Nations Water Conference, the president of Senegal, that is the president Faye, specifically spoke about water access across Africa. The words were actually clear and of course measured. He said in a quote, "More than 40% of Africa's population still lacks access to safe drinking water, and over 70% have no access to basic sanitation services." Quotation close, ladies and gentlemen, said the president of Senegal.
Africa is particularly affected by this crisis. 40% of people lack drinking water access, and over 70% lack basic sanitation. It is a situation unacceptable morally. And while it continues, our collective responsibility will remain engaged.
Now, the statement set a serious tone without a sharp language, ladies and gentlemen. Guess what? The head of state added that this was actually morally unacceptable situation. And he also said that the collective responsibility of the global community remains undeniable. Yes, so these remarks or statements tied basic needs to shared duty. By raising this issue as an international meeting, ladies and gentlemen, the country placed local growth and human needs side by side. Okay, so the link between jobs, food, and of course water became part of the wider story that continues to unfold, ladies and gentlemen. Now, to understand why these two topics matter together, ladies and gentlemen, it helps to look at the broader setting. Senegal, like many countries in Africa or states, is working to build a stronger local systems. Industry helps create jobs and of course incomes, whilst water access supports health and of course food. When one part is weak, ladies and gentlemen, the others feel the strain. Okay, the actions to the water message were calm, ladies and gentlemen, but attentive. Many delegates at the meeting, ladies and gentlemen, listened as the issue was actually placed in clear terms. Water shortages affect farming, daily life, and of course local market, ladies and gentlemen. When clean water is hard to find, food cost can actually rise, and of course work can actually slow. So this can actually push people to move in search of better conditions. These points, ladies and gentlemen, were actually shared in a factual way without a strong emotion to keep focus on solutions. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, the new industry site aim to reduce some of these pressures. Okay, local processing can actually shorten supply chains and of course lower cost. Okay, jobs created near home can actually reduce the need for people to leave their communities. Okay, so whilst factories do not actually solve water shortages on their own, ladies and gentlemen, they formed part of a wider effort to build stability. Each response supports another, showing how growth and of course basic needs are linked in quiet but clear ways, ladies and gentlemen. Looking ahead, these actions suggest a steady path rather than a sudden shift or change. The industrial projects are expected to grow over time, adding more companies and more workers as plans will actually mature. So careful management will be needed to keep progress balanced and inclusive, ladies and gentlemen. The focus remains on long-term benefits rather than quick gains, which helps reduce risk and builds trust. Okay, so on the global stage, ladies and gentlemen, the water message is likely to stay a part of ongoing talks. By framing access to water as a shared duty, ladies and gentlemen, Senegal has placed the issue within a wider moral and practical space. Okay, continuous dialogue may help align support, founding, and of course action. Though changes usually take time, the tone used leaves room for cooperation and of course learning. So together, ladies and gentlemen, these steps show how one country is linking local development with global concern. Factories, farms, and of course water systems all touch daily life in simple ways. Okay, so watching how these efforts move forward, ladies and gentlemen, can actually offer lessons for others facing similar needs. So the story, okay, remains open, with each step adding quiet detail. Precious viewers, if you actually found this report helpful or important, please like the video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel,